I first began coming to China in early 1989. For 30 years, I've witnessed the country becoming the second largest economy in the world. Once a backward economy and a closed society, China is now engaged openly with every country on earth. This year, 2018, marks 40 years of China's reform and opening up, a historic era of economic dynamism and social development. Looking to the past, what challenges were faced? What obstacles were overcome? Looking to the future, what lessons to learn, what principles to apply. Watch our special series on Closer to China, 40 years and counting. In this 40th year of China's reform and opening up, President Xi Jinping calls for comprehensively deepening reform and further opening up. That's why we titled this series 40 Years and Counting, Transforming Reform and Opening Up for the New Era. What lessons have been learned? What challenges lie ahead? In this episode on social reform, we explore people's demand for better health care, education, social security, a cleaner environment, and reduced disparities between rich and poor. The best way to view social reform over the past 4 decades and into the future is through the lens of what is called the principal contradiction, a concept that defines the most significant or pressing issue that needs to be addressed. During most of the 4 decades of reform and opening up, the principal contradiction was the ever-growing material and cultural needs of the people versus backward social production. Now, even as China achieves its goal of becoming a moderately prosperous society, there is growing dissatisfaction with social conditions. Thus, in President Xi Jinping's new era, the new principal contradiction has changed. It is now between unbalanced and inadequate development and the people's ever-growing needs for a better life. Why did Xi call the change a historic shift that affects the whole landscape? Understanding how China's new principal contradiction places new demands on the party and the country brings us closer to China. To Chinese born before the 1980s, ration coupons were a mark imprinted in their memories. They represent the severe shortages of food and goods in the 1950s to 1980s. Throughout the country, in every household, people lived a frugal life. For people to receive food and other life necessities, including oil, meat, clothes, and bicycles, the central government had to issue various ration books. The system ensured that the distribution of commodities was as equitable as possible. Change began in 1978, the beginning of reform and opening up. Structural reforms were carried out, first in rural areas and then in cities. Private enterprises began to boom and the market economy emerged. People started to spend a smaller share of their incomes on food and more on seeking a higher quality of life, materially and spiritually. Today, following Japan and the United States, a growing number of young urban dwellers in China choose to fund their lifestyles with installment payments as the country transitions from shortages to affluence with a growing middle class. But after 4 decades of reform and opening up, why must China now, in China's new era, comprehensively deepen reform and further opening up? To find out, I meet Zhang Bijan, longtime senior advisor to China's leadership, and Li Zhonru, former vice president of the Central Party School, the highest educational institution that trains CPC officials. After 4 decades of reform and opening up, why must China now, in China's new era, comprehensively deepen reform and further opening up?
Fundamentally, domestic development must meet the people's aspirations for a good life. strive for greater heights in productivity. That leaves no room for stagnation. If productivity grinds to a halt, China may fall into the so-called Latin American trap, the essence of which is economic stagnation. That's also the crucial domestic reason why some of those countries failed in their industrial restructuring. With that, their productivity ground to a halt, striving for greater heights in productivity.
What has been the principal contradiction in the past, going back to the foundation of the People's Republic of China? How then was it operating under Deng Xiaoping? And now the new principal contradiction, how important is that in the new kind of comprehensive social reform in the new era?
What is the principal contradiction within underdeveloped socialism and the primary stage of socialism? That's the contradiction between the people's ever-growing cultural and material needs and their backward social productivity. The Deng Xiaoping theory corrected Mao's focus on class struggle, which we experience in Mao's later years. At the 6th plenary session of the 11th CPC Central Commission, this Deng Xiaoping theory was written into the party documents. We'd arrived at a critical conclusion. China is now at the primary stage of socialism and will remain there for a long time. During this period, the principal contradiction is that tension between the people's ever-growing cultural material needs, yet there's still backward social productivity. As a result, we must focus on economic development, unfetter the forces of productivity, and adhere to the policy of reform and opening up. We strive to seek truth from facts, exploring these principal contradictions which exist within very complicated social phenomena. Secondly, we must identify which stage our society is at when placed in the context of these social contradictions. Then, we should decide on the core task for that developmental stage and set our policies and guidelines accordingly. From the Chinese perspective, it's part of our political philosophy.
During the early decades of reform and opening up, social benefits were, as a result, derivative from economic growth. However, as we're now looking into the new era, the new principal contradiction is not just providing more stuff economically, but a relationship between people wanting a better life, which is not necessarily only materially oriented, and the kinds of production, the imbalanced production that's necessary to get there.
While our production has seen the greatest advancement, the people's demand for a better life is more than a basic right to life, but has expanded to rights of personality, property and health. This requires a process of economic reform that doesn't just focus on economic growth, but also reform of the social government system. On the one hand, I believe the government should pay more attention to our overall economic social development, including social security capacity, healthcare, education and care for the elderly. On the other hand, we should encourage social organizations, like social intermediate groups, to play their due role.
How important is this new principal contradiction in understanding China's social conditions today and prescribing specific policies in the future?
If you listen to the official language of China, the official language goes as follows. For the reform we have carried out, for the success we have accomplished, China continued to be in the stage of a primary stage of socialism. Now measured in GDP per capita, it's probably within the range of a middle income primary stage. The previous round of Chinese economic reforms, in a big part, had to deal with what is called shortage economy. So the task is to deal with the quantity of goods. Now we have quantity of goods. Everywhere you go, you see people are buying things, people eat a lot. But then what about the quality of the goods and the services? We are not there yet. And that actually is a reflection of the middle range of global technology that China is in. In other words, to improve the quality of goods and the services, China need to continue to learn to climb up the technology ladder globally. There are areas that should pay special attention to. One is education, the other is healthcare, and the third one, the aging, of course, is healthcare, including aging, and the third one is service industry.
In accordance with this new principal contradiction, China has identified 4 main tasks for our future development. First, we must commit ourselves to address the problem of imbalanced development. Second, we must tackle the problem of inadequate development, especially insufficient development in poverty-stricken areas across our society and within our ecological civilization. Third, we must carry out supply-side structural reform to satisfy society's higher material and cultural needs. Fourth, in addition to satisfying those needs, we must strive to meet people's demands for greater democracy, rule of law, fairness, justice, environmental protection, and public safety. It's very important to have a clear grasp of China's principal contradiction. It shows what tasks Xi Jinping is up to, what tasks the Communist Party of China is up to, and what Chinese society wants to achieve. Completing these 4 tasks would overcome the greatest difficulties that the Chinese people currently face. That's why I think identifying the principal contradiction is so significant.
China's continuing unbalanced and inadequate development suggests that it is now time to pay more attention to the distributive justice of national resources and social wealth. Previously, China focused almost entirely on development, making the economic pie as large as possible, but the ways and means of sharing it have not yet proved equitable. While visitors to Shanghai and Beijing see little difference between Chinese metropolises and their U.S. or Japanese counterparts, other parts of China look more like poor rural countries. The Daliang mountain region is one of the most underdeveloped in China. At its heart is a village situated at the top of a 2,600-foot tall peak. The village is nicknamed Cliff Village. The village attracted worldwide attention in 2016 when village children, just to go to school, were pictured traveling 2 hours, climbing 17 cliff ladders. It was said to be the world's most dangerous school commute. The 72 households living in the Cliff Village were fortunate compared to other of the 30 million Chinese living in extreme poverty. To meet the village needs for education, the local government built a steel ladder costing more than 1 million yuan. While China's achievements of 40 years of reform and opening up have been remarkable, a wide disparity has developed between, on the one extreme, coastal areas at the cutting edge of the developed world, and, on the other extreme, rural inland towns where water still needs to be carried from wells by hand. In 1994, you published research on China Regional Gap Report. What was the gap back then, which you recognized, and now, 24 years later, we're not only talking about the disparities and imbalances between East and West and rural and urban, but the disparities today, the gaps are much bigger than they were when you first recognized it. So why are the gaps have grown worse than they were when you first identified it?
China's regional disparities emerged within the planned economy, then began to decline. Yet the wealth gap widened during the first decade of reform and opening up, and widened even further in the 1990s. In 2004, the disparity reached its peak in terms of GDP per capita. The report of the CPC's 19th National Congress acknowledged that closing these gaps can't be done overnight, so it clearly stated that China must continue to coordinate regional development and keep narrowing the gap until 2035 or even until 2050. It's actually a process of interaction between society building and reform of social institutions.
In understanding how to use the new principal contradiction since the 19th Party Congress going forward, some of the issues are not just economic, although they all have economic components. So how do you, as an economist, address the issues of the new principal contradiction?
I believe there are 4 kinds of imbalance. The first is the imbalance between urban and rural development. The main reason for this imbalance is that the rates of urbanization and industrialization are out of balance too. The second imbalance is caused by the distribution of income. The economic coefficient of primary distribution is too high, which helps explain why prosperity hasn't spread more evenly. The third kind is regional imbalance. The gap between China's regions is relatively large by international standards. Lastly, the fourth imbalance is that our social security system has not yet met the needs of the people. It's failed to make up for the excessive gap in primary distribution. Of these four kinds of imbalance, two are geographic, between urban and rural areas and regions. The other two are institutional, primary and secondary distribution, which are somewhat intertwined.
There are some voices that say that private enterprise and private business has major driver of the vast inequalities in China today, where there's a vast difference between rich and poor, and it gets exaggerated when people see that there are now a very large number of Chinese billionaires in dollar terms. So that's 10 billion, more than 10, almost 10 billion in RMB terms. So how do you respond to that argument that private business has created this vast disparity in Chinese society?
As a socialist country, China, in theory, probably should not have witnessed such capital gains. The country is now experiencing what we call strong capital returns and weak labor returns, which means higher returns for the former. We inherited this problem from our rapid growth. China was lacking capital, so to fuel GDP growth, local authorities implemented favorable policies to attract capital investment. The government should have intervened in developing the market economy to strike a balance between the employers, the owners of capital, as the demand side of labor, and the employees, who are the supply side of labor. However, in order to achieve faster GDP growth, many local governments attached greater importance to capital, leading to stronger capital returns. In the process, they violated national tax policies and offered land for free. Who paid the expenses associated with this land? The whole society paid for it. Thus, in the distribution of social wealth, the owners of capital received the lion's share. To fundamentally solve this problem, China must stop local governments from competing for GDP growth.
So what are some of your prescriptions of what should happen in order to rebalance the relationship between capital and labor and reduce the inequalities in society?
One way is to establish a unified, healthy labor market. It may sound like it has little to do with income distribution, but it does. The labor market is also artificially divided by our household registration system, which has resulted in a large group of migrant workers whose wages have long been depressed. Moreover, there's an urgent need to improve the capacity of workers, which correlates to raising their remuneration. The two are indeed interrelated. Without improved worker capacity, there's no foundation to raise remuneration. Yet stepping up productivity and encouraging innovative growth requires a more capable labor force. As China shifts its focus from high-speed growth to high-quality development, from low labor costs to innovative growth, and from labor-intensive to high labor capacity, the government is already providing more vocational and re-employment training to those workers transferred from overcapacity industries. The issue that's high on the agenda is how to provide better education to these workers and match that to market demands.
Decades of rapid economic growth and urbanization, for all its good, have engendered serious problems, especially wide inequalities and severe pollution, which in turn have fueled social discontent and even resentment. President Xi Jinping vows to do more to improve the lives and address the concerns of the people and use development to promote social fairness and justice. Xiaojia Lane in China's Chengdu city has been largely forgotten. More than half of its 14,000 residents lived in single rooms no larger than 100 square feet. It was the classic urban village. The people who lived here came from the very bottom of Chinese society, most of whom could not afford to buy new apartments. In the early 2000s, the Chengdu municipal government planned to tear down Xiaojia Lane as part of its urban redevelopment. In return, all single-room owners would receive an apartment with 1 bedroom and 1 living room. In response, to bargain collectively with the local government, Xiaojia Lane residents founded an autonomous community committee led by Xiang Yuanqi. After a door-to-door survey, Xiang Yuanqi found that a majority of residents strongly supported the project, but a majority did not mean everyone. That's when he, on behalf of the community, bargained with the local authorities and upgraded the compensation to an apartment with 2 bedrooms and 1 living room. It was the first time that an autonomous residence committee modified the edict of China's administrative system. What can we say about the development of social reform under the 4 decades of reform and opening up?
Social reform in China covers a wide range of areas, like reform of the social management system. For example, some communities now have their own resident committees, including street and village committees. That's a systemic transformation. Second, to change social concepts requires the improvement of social services. Service centers are now capable of providing comprehensive services to the public, such as household registration applications, subsidies, and wage payments. Over the past 40 years, social reform has seen great achievements. What's taking shape is a more law-based society with greater autonomy and broader citizen participation.
It's actually a process of interaction between society building and reform of social institutions. The target is several significant goals. First, to build a social security network that covers a full life cycle. What does full life cycle mean? It includes unemployment insurance, maternity insurance, compensation for work-related accidents, and last but not least, a renewed focus on pension insurance. Second, social reform should strive to provide basic public service for all citizens in all areas. Generally speaking, we aim for reform that will minimize the social costs, maximize the social benefits, and make social services accessible to all citizens.
I believe that the social agenda is going to be more and more important. For every country that has a higher middle income, and China will at some point in the next decade will be a high-income country, that social agenda of distribution, of quality health care, of solid pensions, is going to be an important factor for reforms. That hasn't been neglected in the past, but it will take on more prominence.
When we talk about social reform during the 40 years of reform and opening up, really 2 big categories. One that we talk about easily, healthcare, education, retirement, all different kinds of social services that need to be funded and allocated fairly, and those are huge problems. There's another category, And it's really the thought process or the freedom of individuals in society to be free to do things on a personal basis. We're not talking about the same kind of political freedoms. We are talking about personal freedoms and social freedoms to live where they want or dress where they want or get a job or quit a job or go to school. How significant has that been? And maybe that's underappreciated because young people today never knew it another way.
Well, to understand China better, you need to take two pictures. One is a static picture. The other is a moving picture, it's a dynamic picture. But I think a deeper way to understand China, how far has China reformed itself till now, we need to take a moving picture. 40 years ago, it is unimaginable for someone like me to sit down and to talk to you. Now, it's free talk. I do not have to report to anyone. I just talk to you and to offer what I have in my mind about or my assessment of the reform and opening process in China. Having said that, not every aspect in China is satisfactory. And that is why China is still what I would call a transitional economy. Everything continues to be in the transition. And there I have to argue, when we transit, the vector has to be correct. The direction has to be correct. Are there evidence that support the general direction that is correct? And I would say yes, in spite of the fact there will be zigs and zags in the process. There will be zigzags, but the general direction is that. So in terms of the general direction, I continue to be optimistic. In absolute terms, everyone has gained. In relative terms, someone has lost. But I tend to agree with Deng Xiaoping's proposition that to solve those problems, growth is the recipe. In Chinese, it's called 发展是硬道理. You need to grow yourself out of those problems. So inclusive, sustainable growth is very key insofar as those problems are concerned.
China's new principal contradiction, while typically terse and elliptical, frames a rich tapestry of risks and opportunities, strategy and tactics, policy drivers and targeted reforms, all of which will shape China's prospects for the foreseeable future. For those who see the distinction between the new principal contradiction and the old one as without a real difference, miss an opportunity to discern what is really happening in China. After 40 years of economic boom, China has enabled a large majority of its almost 1.4 billion people to live adequate lives, but people now want better lives, and requirements for better lives are increasingly broad. As President Xi said, not only have the people's material and cultural needs grown, their demand for democracy, rule of law, fairness and justice, security, and a better environment are increasing. The message is that while economic growth remains necessary, it is no longer sufficient. This new era contradiction, replacing quantitative GDP growth with qualitative quality of life improvement, is what will now drive policy. For example, it's not that people cannot afford medical care. It's that they must wait for hours at overcrowded hospitals, and even then get only 5 minutes with a doctor. It's not that people do not have good homes. It's that they do not have clean air. Opening up is also about opening up of people's minds. Success will be measured more by the satisfaction of the people than by the growth of the economy. Will satisfaction be harder to judge? Chinese people are not shy. In the next and final episode, we ask why, after 4 decades, does China still need to reform and opening up? That's Closer to China.